Support for this program is provided by the Foundation for Excellence in Louisiana Public Broadcasting.
Hello and welcome to Louisiana Public Square. I'm Beth Courtney, president of Louisiana Public Broadcasting.
And I'm Craig Freeman, media law professor for LSU. If you were to write a book about milestones in American gay culture, the last several months would definitely be front and center. A professional male athlete proudly comes out on the cover of the nation's most popular sports magazine. The Boy Scouts, one of the largest youth organizations in the country, agrees to admit openly gay members. And the highest court in the land finds that marriage isn't necessarily defined as between one man and one woman.
But the story is still being written on what the June decision by the Supreme Court will mean for the estimated 9 million gays in America. Tonight we contribute our own chapter as we explore how the ruling may affect those living in Louisiana, what rights gays do and do not have in the state, and how those rights compete with other citizens' religious liberties. All this and more as Louisiana Public Square investigates the issues of being gay in Louisiana. Since the June 26 Supreme Court ruling on the Defense of Marriage Act, Baton Rouge attorney Gregory Irwin has been much busier than usual.
I've been contacted by pastors in Texas, Louisiana, Tennessee. There's interest all over the country.
Irwin represents the Louisiana Baptist Convention, a statewide association of over 1,600 churches. Irwin says church leaders are concerned about threats the ruling may pose to the free exercise of their religion.
Will their pastors be forced to perform marriages for same-sex couples? Will they be forced to rent their facilities or allow the use of their facilities for homosexual weddings?
While Irwin admits that there are no current laws in place forcing churches to make these decisions, he feels that the current legal climate, especially in Washington, makes these battles of conscience inevitable.
That's at play in the health care law, where those who don't want to pay for or be supportive of abortion are being forced to pay for that under the law.
A 2009 study by the Beckett Fund for Religious Liberty found that if same-sex marriage was to be legally recognized across the country, those with conscientious objections could face penalties under 350 existing anti-discrimination laws. Just last week, the New Mexico Supreme Court ruled that a photographer who refused to shoot a same-sex wedding violated the state's Human Rights Act.
Regardless of how you believe on the issue of whether it's right or wrong to marry same-sex couples, that should not be used to diminish the rights of those of us who want to practice our faith and our religion the way we have always done so in this country.
This is not a religious issue. This is a civil rights issue.
John Hill is with the Forum for Equality in Louisiana, a gay rights advocacy group. He lives with his fiancée, John Weimer, in New Orleans. By citing the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause, Hill says the Supreme Court's decision on DOMA basically gives tacit approval to same-sex unions nationwide.
It's over. It is over with all over the country. It's just going to take a time for all the cases to get up there and for all the dominoes to fall.
Louisiana's Constitution has its own Defense of Marriage Amendment in place. Sponsored in 2004 by then State Representative Steve Scalise, 78% of voters approved the act defining marriage as between one man and one woman. 30 other states have similar provisions. Hill, the former Capitol Bureau chief for Gannett, says the High Court's decision puts Louisiana's amendment at risk.
I was in the legislature when they enacted the constitutional amendment. I can tell you they intended to do harm to a politically unpopular group. So, and that's cited in the Supreme Court decisions as no reason for discrimination.
According to a national survey conducted by Gallup in February of this year, 3.2% of Louisiana adults, or over 145,000 residents, identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender. The national average is 3.5%. Louisiana essentially prohibits gay couples from adopting, since it's illegal for unmarried couples to do so. Louisiana is also one of 23 states that does not explicitly prohibit housing discrimination based on a person's sexual orientation. And while Governor Blanco signed anti-discrimination protections for gay state workers into law in 2004, Governor Jindal allowed the measure to lapse in 2008. An attempt to pass similar protections this legislative session failed.
I think that that's a terribly unfair proposition, that somebody, because of who they are and how they were created, can be fired from a job and have absolutely nothing to say about it.
Joe Tregle is a Baton Rouge businessman and activist who has been in a same-sex relationship for 20 years. A former Secretary of Revenue and bank president, Tregle says the state's attitudes towards gays affects its bottom line.
I'm a former chairman of the chamber here in Baton Rouge, and I have seen situations over the past 20 years, one in particular I can think of, where we lost 860 jobs because of a report that was done that showed our bigotry and intolerance was off the charts.
In 2009, Tregle attempted to get the capital city to pass the One Baton Rouge resolution, which would have promoted the area as accepting of all lifestyles. The city council failed to pass the measure by one vote.
We don't believe in creating special rights for a few. We believe that the law ought to apply universally to each individual, and the policy of a local municipality ought to reflect that as well.
Gene Mills is the president of the Louisiana Family Forum. His group sent an open letter to Mayor Kip Holden, signed by over 50 religious leaders, opposing the One Baton Rouge resolution. The signers expressed concern that the measure gives the sin of homosexuality a gesture of respectability that goes against their conscience. Mills' group also lobbied in 2012 against Representative Pat Smith's unsuccessful anti-bullying law that enumerated protected categories, including sexual orientation.
Look, we always have held that there ought to be equal treatment under the law. You don't accomplish that when you create special categories of protection that other people are not entitled to. And that's the problem with introducing a legally undefined terminology, sexual orientation, into a protected category.
But Hill contends that laws don't apply equally to gays and points to the recent sting operation conducted by East Baton Rouge Parish Sheriff Sid Gautreaux, which apparently targeted gays and bisexuals. The arrests of over a dozen men received national attention because they were charged under the anti-sodomy statute, which was declared unconstitutional in 2003.
Here we are in 2013 enforcing a law that was struck down by the United States Supreme Court 10 years ago.
Hill and his partner were recently targets of vandalism. In the early hours of August 3rd, a man tore down one of their gay pride rainbow flags, then spray-painted a homophobic slur on their home. The FBI is investigating the act as a hate crime. Hill says that no matter what your opinion of the gay lifestyle is, all individuals should be treated with dignity and respect.
No one should live in fear of going outside their house. No one should live in fear of losing their job because of who they are. No one should live in fear of having anything happen to them because of who they are. That is not permissible in our society in 2013.
Joining us in our studio to discuss gay issues in Louisiana are residents from the greater Baton Rouge area. We're also joined by students from Southern, ULL, and the Legislative Youth Advisory Council, as well as members of Equality Louisiana and the First Baptist Church of Zachary. Welcome, everyone. LSU's Public Policy Research Lab surveyed over 100 citizens for tonight's topic. Among the survey responses, when asked if they had a friend, family member, co-worker, or acquaintance that they knew was gay, nearly 3/4, or 73% of respondents said yes, 26% said no, and 1% were unsure. When asked their view of the gay lifestyle of those expressing an opinion, 57% said that being gay is just the way that some people choose to live, 28% said people are born gay, while 6% attribute being gay as a result of a person's upbringing. Respondents were nearly evenly split on whether gays should be able to legally adopt, with 48% opposed to the idea and 43% supportive. The remaining 9% were either unsure or refused to answer. And when asked if marriages between same-sex couples should be recognized by law and granted the same rights as traditional marriages, 54% of respondents said no, 37% said yes, and the remaining 9% either refused to answer or were neutral. And when asked how serious a problem discrimination against gays in the state is, a total of 51% said not at all or not too serious, while a total of 38% think discrimination against gays is somewhat or a very serious problem in Louisiana. And so let's start there. Based on what you know, or perhaps even a personal experience, do gays face discrimination in Louisiana? How serious is it, and how should we combat it? Are gays discriminated against in Louisiana? Reverend Reggie?
I wouldn't say that they're discriminated against. I would agree that respect should be given to all people, no matter who you are. I understand that. But what we're going to talk about tonight is special rights, I think, not just the respect that we should give.
Okay, so it's not as much about, your concern is more about special rights than it is about the way that we treat each other. Yeah. Jacob, you agree?
Not really. I know of two people personally that have come out to their parents and since have either been kicked out or have faced serious penalties within their home because they've come out to their parents.
And so at least for some of the people that you know, it's been a bit of a struggle since they came out.
Yes.
Okay. Sydney.
Yes, I actually had a very close friend of mine go through a very traumatic coming out experience with his parents who were religiously affiliated and who just could not come to terms with their son's sexuality. And it was very dramatic. He was forced to, live on his own and deal with a lot of financial struggles at a young age that maybe most people wouldn't have to face.
But Reggie is saying that this is not necessarily about what families do to each other, but it's more about what the law does. Do you think that the law affects that, Matthew?
Absolutely. I've lost count of the number of people who've come to us at Equality Louisiana and said, I work at a business in Monroe, and my boss said he didn't want gay people working for him. I work for a company in Baton Rouge, and I was fired because of my sexual orientation or because my boss found out I was transgender. This is something that you have absolutely no legal recourse for. You can't sue for that under state law. And as the intro video said, attempts to add those protections to state law have been unsuccessful. Currently, if you're fired because you're gay, that's it. You have to find another job. You have to do something else. That's all you can do. There's no protections.
Claudia, I see you nodding your head. You agree?
Yeah, I definitely agree. What I think of is if I have grandchildren and my children are same sex, I could lose my grandchildren because they're not protected as a family unit legally.
And so do we need to add more protection, or does society kind of sort it out on its own? Do we need more laws, Joshua?
The same way that we protect minorities from discrimination, it should be all an umbrella law to protect any group of people from discrimination from the majority. That's what these laws are supposed to be.
But now, I've heard some people talk about gay rights as the new civil rights fight. Tranisha, do you agree?
Yes, I do, because I don't think that someone should be discriminated against on their sexual orientation. I feel as though even if my religion may speak against it, who am I to tell you what you should and should not do with your life?
Okay, and so this is our civil rights fight. Reverend Larry.
What I've been hearing in all of these examples are indications that we have this tension between individuals who have certain personal moral compasses. We've been down this road before with civil rights. Right now, we're still struggling with racism because you can't legislate morality. And so you're going to go down the same road with gay rights because the law was never designed to change people's morality. That's a personal choice.
We can't legislate morality, David.
I think, what we're talking about is discrimination at the workplace. Now, within the family unit, that's something different. But I think, I've seen the same federal poster up for years. I've been at the same job for 25 years. And it specifically says you can't be discriminated against based on age, race, gender, or sexual orientation. So does the federal law protect those in the state of Louisiana? I don't know where the conflict is with that, but I just don't really see where there would be any prejudice in this day and age when inclusion and diversity is and your the perception that people have of your business, that it's almost impossible to discriminate against somebody based on their sexual orientation.
It looks like that comment brought a couple of responses I know Matthew and Reggie both want to talk about.
Well, I think it's important to mention that federal law does not protect people from discrimination based on sexual orientation, gender identity, or gender expression. The federal statutes haven't been amended to add those things in. There's a bill currently pending before Congress, the Employment Non-Discrimination Act. It might get a vote before the current Congress is out. It's come up before and been shot down, but I know proponents are a lot more hopeful this time around than they ever have been. But currently in federal law, there's nothing.
Right?
I would respectfully disagree with that comment that you cannot legislate morality. We legislate morality all the time. Whether it's a drunk driver who's killed someone and we hold them accountable, or any other, we legislate morality. It's just whose morality will we choose, I think, is the question to ask it. I will agree with Brother Larry that it is a heart issue that only Christ, I think, can change in us as far as respect with people. But we do legislate morality. Our laws are supposed to be moral laws. Even when President Obama cited the Golden Rule as his reason to change his stance on same-sex marriage, he was appealing to morality. But it was just, whose morality are we talking about? You legislate morality. It's just whose are we going to follow?
We've got a tension here. We've got some people saying you can't legislate morality, some say you can. Is there a middle ground?
Well, I'm gonna start here. Basically, I serve as the Louisiana Youth Leadership Advisory Council president, and I also serve as the LGBTQ Task Force Youth Leadership panelist. So basically, right now we're trying to upcome with these different laws and things. We're trying to train different advocacies, the DCFS, different youth, different juvenile justices, so we can try to get these laws passed. Because I do feel as if we're stuck right now as a society.
We need to do more. Armin, you agree?
I would definitely say that equality comes from inclusion, not from making certain assumptions that don't have any sort of legal protections.
Can laws solve this issue, or is this something that we as a community have to solve without the pressure of law?
I think ultimately the way society is changing, looking at national polls and how they've changed over the years, it is working in favor of, acceptance of gays and people of different lifestyles. But you need to legislate things if it's going to affect someone else.
When we're talking about legislating morality and laws, obviously that changes and has progressed. Now, we've had a United States Constitution and, of course, many laws and many amendments that have been made to that, and then the individual states, such as Louisiana, that has taken a stand for traditional marriage, of which I adhere to, a biblical view of marriage. I think the problem comes when we're trying to deal with morality and even legislating morality is who is determining where the standard is. And of course the standard continues to move, and who's moving the standard. I don't believe we're really capable of completely establishing our own standard of right and wrong. That's why we need a higher standard. That's why we have the Bible. So we need a higher standard than what we can set ourselves.
Well, we've got some people that can hopefully address this higher standard in a couple of minutes. And so that's all the time we have for this portion of our show. When we return, we'll be joined by a panel of experts to further explore gay issues in Louisiana. Welcome back to Louisiana Public Square. Tonight, we're discussing the issue of being gay in Louisiana. Joining us now is our panel of experts. John Denison is the chair of the Forum for Equality Foundation, an organization advocating for the rights of gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender people in Louisiana. An award-winning journalist, Mr. Denison anchored the news for KNOE television in Monroe for more than 20 years. Father Bryce Sibley is a Catholic priest serving as the pastor and chaplain of Our Lady of Wisdom Church on the campus of the University of Louisiana at Lafayette. Father Sibley travels extensively, speaking on issues regarding faith, marriage, and sexual ethics. Ron Wilson is an attorney whose focus is public interest and civil rights litigation. Employed by the firm of Sherman & Jones, Mr. Wilson is also a cooperating attorney with the American Civil Liberties Union of Louisiana and the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. Senator Daniel Claytor is a Republican from Baton Rouge. He is vice chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee. This past session, Senator Claytor sponsored legislation to remove an unconstitutional statute from the Louisiana Constitution, Louisiana's Balanced Treatment for Creation Science Act. The amendment failed. Gentlemen, before we go to our audience for questions, if you could each briefly tell us from your perspective what stands out most about the Supreme Court ruling on the Defense of Marriage Act. Maybe John, can you help us out?
Certainly. We are a people, LGBT people in the United States, who have been discriminated against. When we're talking about the same-sex marriage ruling, DOMA, and the repeal of DOMA, we're talking about equal rights for a class of citizens. We're not talking about special rights. We're talking about equal rights. We're not talking about a religious concern. Same-sex marriage is not a religious concern. In this debate, it is a legal concern.
Well, I would say two things. First of all, that at least the decision did return, in a certain sense, the litigation, the discussion to the states without federally imposing something. But second, when it comes to understanding what Justice Scalia said in his dissenting opinion, with the attack, it seemed, or the comments from Justice Kennedy that those who oppose gay marriage, who want to say that it should be between man and woman, are somehow bigoted or hateful. This is simply not the case. It really doesn't have much to do with a certain subset of people, but our understanding of what marriage is in and of itself, whether or not sexual difference and masculinity and femininity are integral to our understanding of marriage.
I think it highlights the new civil rights movement. I think in terms of Loving versus Virginia, Supreme Court case, Virginia had a statute which prohibited, it's called an anti-miscegenation statute, which prohibited the marriage of blacks and whites. As a matter of fact, you could go to jail for it. And the Supreme Court said one of the most fundamental rights, if not the most fundamental right, is the right to marry. And so I think the Supreme Court is doing the same thing now with DOMA. It's saying, regardless of whether or not you're male, female, two males, two females, the fundamental right to marry is yours. And it's not for a religious organization or a state to control that. So I think we saw that with Loving versus Virginia, and we're seeing that with the DOMA case. This is a new civil rights movement.
Well, first I'd like to do a little disclaimer on the introduction. You said these are experts on being gay in Louisiana. So not to cast aspersions, but I'm not an expert on that issue. But secondly, as far as the change in the law, we've gone from a Lawrence decision that was more of a due process liberty type of concern to an equal protection argument. And so I'm here chiefly as a legislator to add that element to what's going on here, but as a lawyer, I see a change in the way that the matter is being examined by the Supreme Court.
Okay, and now, I know, Madeline, you had a question that you wanted to start us off with on the second part.
Thank you. I have a quick question. As we are evolving as a state socially, do y'all believe that our laws should also evolve, or should we stand firm in our beliefs and or our morals?
Well, of course they should evolve as society evolves, and society is definitely evolving on the issue of LGBT rights, and particularly this year, same-sex marriage. And Louisiana cannot be out of lockstep with the other parts of the country. We have 13 states now that allow marriage, that have statutes that allow same-sex couples to marry, and we have federal protections for those people. In the other states, we either have statutes or we have, like in Louisiana, a constitutional ban on marriage between people of the same sex. And we are now moving as a society. You saw the polling earlier. That was an only 100-person sample. I would cite a poll that got widespread play on the day of the Supreme Court rulings and back in February that showed a slight majority, a little over 50% of Louisianans now support either same-sex marriage or civil unions.
I would say certainly, without a doubt, laws have to evolve. But what we're talking about is whether or not marriage, as we understand it, having sexual differences integral to it, can evolve. Can human nature evolve? Is marriage something which is written into our human nature, the purposes of our body, what we're meant for, what our organs are meant for, what our body is meant for, or is it a purely social construct? I'm going to argue the fact that marriage, a conjugal view, where not only our bodies matter for marriage, it is something that is integral to it, not only for the union of the couple, but for bringing forth children and for sort of interacting and making a stable network for a culture. Whereas the other version of marriage is what's been called the revisionist version, where sexual difference doesn't matter and marriage becomes more of a legal agreement or emotional bond. I think that opens up to some pretty serious problems that we need to think about and talk about of how it will change our understanding of marriage as a whole. So I guess my point is, even though laws do change, the real question here is, does human nature change?
We've got a lawmaker. Well, how are we evolving?
Sure. Well, in the introduction, I talked a little bit as far as about the way the Supreme Court is viewing things, moving from a equal protection liberty argument to a due process argument. But the fact of the matter is, on this type of issue in Louisiana, we are rarely the one leading the way on issues that evolve. It comes from California, it comes from New York, and then we tend to follow rather than to lead in these particular type of issues. So, yes, we all evolve as a nation, but there's a lot more to it than just a little discussion that we can have in 30 minutes here.
And Ron, you kind of mentioned some of the miscegnation cases of the, I guess, really the 60s and the 70s. Is that what gay marriage is like today?
Well, but I look around the audience and talking in terms of involvement. Yes, we have involved. I'm the old man on the panel. I'm 62 years old. I grew up during the heyday of the civil rights movement, when blacks and whites just didn't get together in a room like this. And people would always say, you can't legislate morality. But I went to segregated schools, played on segregated teams, but now it's unheard of. So, people have evolved, people have gotten to know each other because of legislation and litigation. So I think the law can help people in society to evolve.
And Taylor, I know you had a question for the panel.
Yeah, Father Bryce Sibley kind of addressed it already. My question was just, since marriage is written into the very human nature of the person by virtue of the fact of the complementarity of the two opposite sexes, how can the state, which is a man-made institution, redefine that? So really the question is, what is marriage and how is that defined? It really, and it can be found in the human person. We don't need the Bible for that. We don't need the state for that. It's found and written in the human person.
Well, it's up to states now to hammer out marriage issues. States issue marriage licenses. They're not issued by religious organizations. They're not issued by any other group other than a state or a city or a county or a parish government. And that's where the licenses are coming from. We're talking about civil licenses. We're talking about legal pieces of paper here.
But there's,
But what you're going to have, you have civil rights and natural rights. And even though a civil society will recognize marriage as a civil right having certain civil dimensions, that right to marriage doesn't come from the state. Just like the right to life doesn't come from the state. If it did, it can give it and take it away. Instead, we believe it's written into human nature. So marriage has a civil dimension, which the state does recognize because marriage is good for a society, but more importantly has a natural dimension. And that a state has the responsibility to recognize that and legislate in accord with it. I think that's what Taylor was trying to say.
Okay. And Caitlin, I know you also had a question.
Yeah, from the financial standpoint of the debate between whether couples should get married or not when they're gay, I hear a lot about the financial benefits that people receive in marriage. But really, what does the title of marriage or a marriage license give people? You can still have the power of attorney, or you can still will something to somebody else without a marriage title.
But for instance, if I want to do that with my partner, unlike you as a straight couple, I have to go to the expense of getting an attorney to draw up those contracts. The people in those 13 states where there's now same-sex marriage are getting 1,100 federal benefits that straight couples get. That's huge. Everything from pensions for people who were killed in the military, Social Security benefits, which of course we saw, then retirement benefits in the case of Edith Windsor. And so there are, yes, financially, it is definitely a burden against the LGBT community.
I think also with the tax consequences too. Yeah. That if you're a same-sex couple, I guess prior to DOMA, you didn't get the federal tax consequences. And that's a big difference as to why marry and why not marry.
That's what the Windsor case was all about. It was about a tax consequence, and that's the two cases that we're talking about here as far as coming out. So there are tax consequences associated with the way the government does it. Taylor had an important point earlier on as far as whether the government recognizes a union or not, and whether it's a civil union, governments didn't always get involved in the marriage business, and that was left to the church in a lot of instances originally. But with the transfer of property and benefits that come along with the federal government, there's some legislation that becomes necessary at that point.
Larry, I know we've got a question.
Yeah, there are some issues that are hidden and embedded in this issue, and I'm 62 too, so I grew up in a segregated society, and the first notion is that we've resolved the racism issue with legal means, and we have not. The second issue is we try to put this issue of gay marriage into a civil rights arena. There's no study, no definitive study that says that gay marriage is nothing more than a choice. I didn't choose to be an African American. And so, and one more thing. I heard what Les said about standards. By definition, a standard doesn't change. And what we're doing in this country is moving from an attitude of contribution to an attitude of entitlement. And what's going to eventually happen, there has to be a limit to the rights extended to the individual. I can walk around with a T-shirt on and no shoes. I'm free to do that without consequence, but I can't go in a Circle K like that. And so when, like this August, a lady in the bakery refused to make a cake for a gay couple, and so now she has to face charges for that, and so there has to be, what I'm saying is this, there has to be a discussion. There was never a discussion with civil rights. It was just legislation. The two sides didn't get together and discuss this. They didn't learn about each other. None of that took place. We're going to go down the same road when we push this legislation and not look at every area that can be discussed in this issue.
Well, I think
last thing. One of the stabilizing factors in our country is that my rights as an individual are unlimited as long as they don't infringe upon yours. We can only go so far in extending individual rights, and what we're going to end up with is a destabilization of our way of life.
Well, first of all, I heard Jason Carroll, the NBA player, on the Video Music Awards the other night come out and say, of course we know now he has come out as a gay man, and said that choosing to be gay was no different from him. He did not choose to be gay, just like he did not choose to be black. And his grandmother said, son or grandson, it was not a choice. You are what you are. I did not choose this. I asked people, when did you choose to be straight? This is what I am. This is what I've been since my earliest memories.
Reverend Larry, I close my eyes and I think about the same arguments that were raised against civil rights for black people. That you're pushy, you're pushing too hard. That my right to not serve you primes your right to be served in my restaurant. But these are the same arguments I heard years ago, and if those arguments carried any weight, again, there were laws, as you will admit, when you and I were growing up. It was against the law for whites and blacks to get together in a given spot. So, the same arguments that were used to deny and deprive us of rights as African Americans, the same arguments are being used to deprive gay single-sex couples of the same rights.
That's not an exactly parallel.
Okay. Let me. And Matthew brought this up a little earlier. There are a lot of issues here to deal with, but what's happening is, I think, we fall into this discussion of rights as begging the question to say that, of course, those who identify as homosexual have certain rights, but to claim to have the right to marriage, you just can't say it. You've got to give a proof, particularly if you are going to change the status quo. People say, well, my rights are being denied. Well, demonstrate to me why you have the right to that. Because if this is true, and if your argument is true, you're redefining marriage as a whole. And so I think we got to avoid that fallacy of begging the question. What we really need to do in our discussion is, if we're going to change the status quo, the burden of proof falls upon those who want to change the law, and to say that somehow sexual difference is not integral to marriage, and to present a convincing argument.
Well, Justice Kennedy wrote in the majority that we are we are denying people equal rights.
But
it is that simple.
But he never said why they have this right to marriage.
Well, let me give you an example of one of the things that we're facing in Louisiana, particularly with employment. Matthew brought up a young man in Monroe who I spoke with on the phone today because he reached out to me on Facebook. He had to endure for the last few weeks or maybe even months harassment on the job. He's a server at a restaurant, a good server, he said, because he had worked at the restaurant for some time, left the state, came back several months ago, and went back to work for the same owner. But this time, there was a woman working there who told him things like, you're gay, you're going to hell, you can't sing a Christian song because you don't know what being Christian is all about. And he was harassed on the job for his sexual orientation. He went to his owner, and the owner says, well, I'm sorry, but you know what, I'm going to have to side with her on this one, and I'm going to demote you from assistant manager to just being a server now.
Certainly.
So he has now decided that he cannot work in this hostile environment. We have no law protecting the person who is lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender in the workplace, and we must have that.
Certainly an argument can be made for that, and such unjust discrimination is incorrect. What I'm talking about here more specifically is marriage and redefining marriage, because I think you have the issue of how we treat people with dignity as individuals. We talk about anti-discrimination laws, but we pass in to say somehow to deny a person, a homosexual couple, the right to marriage is discriminating. That begs the question of whether or not they have the right to marriage in the first place.
Number one, I want to say that you can control morality through laws. I believe so, because you can say, okay, don't do this, it's the law. But you can, you can't do it out in the open, but you can still do it behind closed doors. So in that way, you can control the way people would control themselves in public. And the second point is I wanted to challenge what you said about deciding whether or not you wanted to become gay or straight. There is also a factor in medications, and where it may change your perception of things and may make you think something that's true is not true, and make you definitely become deviant socially. So
sexual orientation, like I feel, with my sexual attraction towards someone of the same sex, is innate, and I have felt it my entire life. I tried not to act on it because society has been telling me for all of these years, don't be out and gay, because, and you pick the argument, you're going to hell, you're going to get fired on the job. I was threatened with my job by a candidate for public office in Monroe several years ago, in fact in 2006, who called and emailed my owner with a potential lawsuit because Louisiana still has the anti-sodomy law on the books, even though the Supreme Court wiped them off the books nationwide in 2004. Well, 2 years later, he threatened to sue over a story he didn't like because he said, you have an anchorman who is an open homosexual and he is violating Louisiana's sodomy law.
And Senator, I know we've got some issues with laws that have been declared unconstitutional but kind of remain on the books in Louisiana.
Right.
How do we solve those issues?
Well, it would seem as though it would be pretty easy that the Supreme Court has made a decision and said that that's unconstitutional. But the politics tend to get in the way where, for example, in the intro there was a law about creationism that's been found unconstitutional. I figured we had a bill coming through that I would just tag something on there and clean it up and we'd be done with it. But you would think that I had done something terrible in that the author of the particular bill couldn't get it out of committee with that amendment on it. So it seems relatively easy, but people, legislators, are apparently frequently afraid to vote for something, even though that it's immaterial and that it'll be misused later on in the campaign. For example, when I was introduced as an expert on gay and this deal, where somebody's going to run that out there at a later time. But I thought this is an important conversation to have, and so I'm happy to be here and to have that discussion. But It's lack of backbone, frankly.
Okay. Now, Taylor, I know you had another question for us.
Yeah, I know we're talking about equality here and all that, but I guess my question would be, where would the line be drawn then if the state has power to draw the line? If we're not going to look at the human body itself, then, you know, a father and a son, why can't they get married? Why can't we have polygamists? Why can't we have... Where's the line get drawn? What's the difference, is what I'm asking.
Well, the line has been drawn already here in the state of Louisiana, in that we had a constitutional amendment on the issue. We legislate, and then the courts pass muster on it. So we think that we're drawing the line at the right place sometimes, and we're not. But as far as what's going on here in Louisiana, it's going to be challenged in the Eastern District of Louisiana in a case called Robichaux. The judge that's been assigned to it is a federal judge by the name of Feldman. So we'll see some things there.
But Ron, you know, one of the questions that I've always had was, I know, say, for an African American, I can identify you as African American, so that's a quality that if I discriminate, it's apparent. If I discriminate against Taylor because she is a woman, that is apparent. But the Supreme Court, at least historically, was reluctant to kind of make that same classification for gay rights because it wasn't as obvious. And so is that changed, or how's the law addressing those kinds of issues?
Well, I don't think the law is. And I think that's somewhat of a, I don't say false premise or false standard that people use by saying that you can't compare African Americans to gays because if a gay man put on a suit and tie and gay white person put on a suit, coat, and tie and walk down the street, and nobody would know the difference. Whereas with a black person, it's an immutable trait. They know that you're a black. But I think that's really a big distinction without a difference, because we're talking about gay people who are proud of being gay, who identify themselves as gay, and aren't reluctant to say that they're gay. So I think that's what the law has to consider. Those individuals right there. Okay. It's not for the person who. I think it's primarily for the person who's clearly identifiable as gay, and the law is designed to protect him to allow him to be himself and be whomever he is.
And well, Father, I also wanted to kind of to touch on that same subject. I know the Pope has made some statements recently about at least perhaps a change in the feelings.
No, that's not the case.
Okay.
The media took it out of context. He was specifically talking about an issue in the Vatican. Okay. And he was really, in his own words, sort of speaking off the cuff, reiterating what the Church always teaches, that we treat individuals with respect and love. He wasn't really talking about the gay marriage issue, because even though the Church has a stance on it, if you notice, I haven't talked about God or talked about the Bible, because it's something that can be discussed from a natural law issue, that a person's faith or belief really doesn't matter. In a certain sense, in a pluralistic society, shouldn't matter. If we're going to be able to have this discussion, the issue that Taylor brought up, I thought was a very valid one. Not a slippery slope in the future, but a slippery slope in premise. That if you say that sexual difference does not matter for marriage, this standard isn't important, well then how do we judge what standards are there? If it's false, if it's discriminatory to say, well, a gay couple can't get married, by what standard? Why isn't it discriminatory to say that what's wrong with polygamy? Why is that not unjust discrimination? So we have to address those issues. We have to have this discussion and think in advance, rather than adhering to slogans and just saying marriage rights or equality, without thinking it through and seeing how it's going to affect other things.
And Joshua?
Why is it so controversial to redefine marriage? Because our president, when his parents came together, that was at a time when 2 out of 3 states had it illegal for whites and blacks to get together. They redefined marriage then. Why is it so controversial to redefine marriage now?
Because what we're talking about is redefining something which is substantial to marriage, which no culture has changed. Granted, there are things that are secondary characteristics when it comes to our color or our background, but there's not been a culture that said that sexual difference does not matter. And so it's the importance of masculinity and femininity, the importance of the body as integral, and what can naturally flow from that is the potential of having children. So we're comparing apples and oranges, I think.
I don't think you are. I think if a state says to me, if you cohabit, if you date or marry this white person, you're going to jail. The state is defining who can get married. You're just saying, if you look at the decision in the Loving case, the state is saying that, we're going to define marriage as a union between 2 white people or 2 black people. We're going to say that there cannot be such thing as a legal marriage between a black person and a white person. So in that particular point, you're defining marriage.
But what we're saying, the difference is saying, a black person and a white person should not marry is not saying that they can't and they don't have what's naturally capable for bringing about marriage.
No,
the argument is that
we once said you couldn't. Though.
Right,
That
exactly.
You couldn't, but I'm talking about what is inherently and naturally possible. What the argument here is that marriage is based upon sexual difference. That is necessary for a natural understanding. It's something that the state can't legislate. They say, because we would say that the consummation of that marriage, which is, again, we bring in consummation laws, is impossible. If we understand what consummation is something which is inherently heterosexual.
But I thought marriage is based on love, and so if it's...
Then the body doesn't matter. Then why can't polygamy be legal? Why can't incest be legal? That's the problem. It's all about love. The body doesn't matter. Then let's allow 5 people to
I'm
marry.
sorry, with all due respect, our community has been hearing these arguments for a number of years, and there is really nothing to back them up. It's just that simple. We've been hearing, for instance, that you can pray the gay away. You can have so-called reparative therapy, which in itself is quite an oxymoron. When this year, Exodus International, probably the oldest and one of the largest so-called ex-gay ministries, folded its tent, and the person who was running it at the time apologized to the hundreds of people who came through there and who were told, you can change if you are homosexual. He admitted that 99.9% of the people who came through there failed.
But those are red herrings in regards to the real issue of what the body is meant for, and that we can understand what our body, our sexual organs are meant for, the purpose, regardless of these other issues.
Clay?
I just want to say that throughout history, marriage has served multiple purposes by different societies. Each society has defined marriage differently. I mean, it is throughout the world and throughout history there have been polygyny, polyandry, fictive marriage, group marriages. There, even in many societies, such as in sub-Saharan Africa, they had women marriage, and that is a traditional marriage between two women. So really, and even today, there have been many different countries and regions that have adopted same-sex marriage. So you can't really say that no culture has redefined marriage. And like I said, it is, for us, in the United States, I mean, there actually, even in the United States, there are different forms, different institutions. There's religious and civil, but talking about the civil institution of marriage, it's a civil issue. And two people, I mean, men and women are both citizens. A man's vote is not worth more than a woman's vote. So in each case, whether it's 2 men, 2 women, or a man and a woman, it's 2 people, 2 American consenting adult citizens. And I feel like in a civil institution, they should be able to partake in that.
And Senator, I mean, how's that?
No, I hear what he's saying. And we were talking about the evolution of the law earlier. Once upon a time, 1919, a woman's vote did not count the same as a man's vote. She couldn't vote. Mm-hmm. And so, I mean, we have different things that go forward. I'm concerned on some of the same things as Reverend Larry is, as far as I'm more of an advocate of your civil liberties. Do what you want in your home, and I have no desire, and nobody else should have a desire to know what anybody does at home. That's their own right to privacy there. But as a public official, we got to have these discussions about where are we going in the civil arena, and that's a still developing thing. But as far as Louisiana is concerned, and you look out there and what we've done, we've passed a law that says marriage is between a man and a woman. It was put out to the electorate. They said, as far as a constitutional amendment, that's what we want. But we live in a federalism, and so we're going to hear from the federal government on those issues. But that line is always moving, and we have to, that's the nature of things, is that it does move.
What responsibility do our public officials really have in terms of being morally cognizant of these sorts of issues outside of the constraints of their personal beliefs? If I could say that.
Well, I guess that's to me. Yeah. No, you have a couple of different things that go on there. I need to be responsive to my constituents, and I have a large district that's highly educated and affluent people. I have university people that have one set of beliefs. I have people that live in a more rural area, have a different set of ideas of what's going on. So I probably have the most, I don't want to call it mixed up, but it has a very different feel for it. When you talk to a university professor, they're going to say, why wouldn't that happen? Most of them. You talk to somebody that lives out in Shenandoah, they say, why would you let that happen? And so it's a difficult thing as a public official. And when we go out and run, you learn about us and you decide whether or not that's the kind of guy that you want. But sometimes I do have to vote against what I personally believe. I'm Catholic. I go to the Catholic Church. But we had a surrogacy issue this year in the legislature, and I voted for that. And the Catholic Church came down and said, we're against that. But that's the feeling that I had from my constituency, is that they're for that. So it's not that easy. You do your best to be responsive, and if folks aren't happy with you, they vote you out or you quit.
And Father, how does the church?
Well, speaking from that, I mean, it's a great question. Of course, I as a Catholic priest, I'm going to have my own opinions formed by my faith, but I really think it's the decision or a discussion between faith and reason. Is that while I believe those who, let's say, don't adhere to the same faith should respect my own faith and how it informs my beliefs, I really think it's the church's responsibility in the public square and believers to be able to discuss things using reason and not necessarily having recourse to the Bible. Let's say that you're an atheist, and I say, well, the Bible says this or the Bible says that. You're not going to listen to me. So we have to have a language, a common language, which traditionally has been called the natural law, which is based in the purposes of the body and the natural inclinations, to be able to have that discussion.
Well, I think the natural law might also mean using a club on somebody that doesn't agree with you and beating them to a pulp. And
well,
so,
I mean, it also means that I'm attracted to and I love a person who is just like me.
No, that's not exactly
that
is natural law is.
That is we're talking about nature, not nurture.
No, that's not exactly what we mean when we say natural law. We're not talking about.
That's what I mean.
Yeah, but traditionally, from a legal perspective and from a church perspective, natural law talks about not what exists in nature or what doesn't. We talk about what the purpose or the ends are, particularly here in the human person, and what the body's meant for. So I say that my eyes can have different purposes, but mainly for seeing. If I try to use it for eating or something it's not meant for, it could potentially cause harm. So we're looking at what we call ends or purposes within the body that we can discern biologically and thus derive certain potentially moral and social rules from it.
So how do you explain my same-sex attraction?
Well, that's a whole different discussion. There are a lot of that. We know there's no genetic. We know there's
how do you know that?
Because there's no proof. There's no
scientific proof. There's no proof yet.
That's not true at all. There have been heredity studies. There have been twin studies.
The twin studies show that 17%.
Father, there is not a gene, but there are in fact correlations that can be drawn from biology.
But regardless, just because we have that inclination doesn't mean that we're compelled to act upon it. I may have an inclination to eat things which are not food. Does not mean that's necessarily good for me to eat on that, to eat that stuff. So I think these are more complex discussions.
Well,
and I'm glad we're having.
Okay.
Oh, absolutely.
Let me see if we can add some more voices to the conversation.
Well, two things, two consequences I see. One, that marriage itself, that as we redefine it, that basic unit of culture will be destroyed in a sense, because it will open up for the possibility of polygamy, incestual relationships. You may not want to answer that, but we will be there.
I want to answer that. I don't want that.
We will be there 30.
I can't predict. I cannot look into the crystal ball and see. What I can see is that same-sex marriage in the countries that have already legalized it has improved not only their economies, but has improved their so-called family units.
I would say, okay, that in 30 years or so, we'll be having that discussion. That will be a consequence of this. And we may say that's not what we want now. But again, standards. There is a standard somewhere. It's just that certain people want to impose their standards in this situation. Second is my religious freedom. I would like to ask, I'd like to have it actually on video. Will the ACLU be there for me when I proclaim homosexuality as sin in my pulpit, when I do not allow them to be married in my church, when I will not allow my services to be held? Will the ACLU stand up for me for my religious freedom? Or will they say that I am biased, I am not following the law, and thus I will have to submit in some ways to that government? Because this is the thing. Jesus said that I would render unto Caesar which is Caesar's, and I do that gladly. I serve, I obey my government. But I will not submit or render unto the government what is rightly God's, and that is my conscience, to be able to say I will not perform this wedding. I think that's a question that needs to be asked
Council, what do you think?
Well, I think if you check out the history of the ACLU has been at the forefront, the vanguard of defending religious freedom. And it's a misconception that people have about the ACLU that the ACLU is anti-religion, but it's not. But if you check out the ACLU's history, we're at the forefront of religious liberties. We do defend that. We defend the First Amendment. And if you're within the confines of the First Amendment, we'd be the first ones defending you.
Well, my minister in Monroe, his weekend job is to preach to me and the other members of my congregation at Northminster Baptist Church. During the week, he is president of a group called the Interfaith Alliance, which believes in not only fostering interfaith relations between different religious groups, but also making sure that we keep government and politics separate, as well as religion and religion and politics separate. And he and I would agree with you on the same thing. I can't tell you what to preach in your church, just like I would hope you wouldn't tell him what to preach in ours. But the God that I have found through my search in Christianity as a gay man tells me that this is God. This is what God made. My mother used to keep something on her refrigerator that her niece drew in school, and it said, "God didn't make any junk. I'm not junk, and neither are the people that I love and that I am proud to call my friend."
But we've got to end our conversation at least on the air now, and so we've run out of time in our question and answer segment. But we really want to thank our panelists, Mr. Denison, Father Sibley, Mr. Wilson, and Senator Claytor for their insight on this month's topic. When we come back, we'll have a few closing comments.
We certainly could have continued the conversation a long time.
A long time. I mean, but that's the joy of having the internet, is we get a chance to kind of continue this conversation. A lot more to talk about.
Online.
Right.
And this is a complex topic, and it's one we only talk about in sound bites sometimes, so I love the depth of this conversation.
It's fun.
Although I will tell you, the thing that I'm struck by is that how marriage between anyone is declining. There's so few people getting married who have children today that we worry about that. Right. So in general, that's all the time we have, though, for this edition of Louisiana Public Square. We encourage you to visit our website at lpb.org/public square. While you're there, take this month's survey, view extended interview clips, and comment on tonight's show. We would love to hear from you. Remember, you can also follow us on Facebook and Twitter.
As the school year begins this month, a portion of the state's nearly 700,000 public school students will be attending charter schools. But will they be getting as good an education as their traditional public school peers? Join us next month as Louisiana Public Square looks for answers on Charter Checkup. Thanks for watching, and good night.
Good night, everyone.
For a copy of this program, call 1-800-973-7246 or go online to www.lpb.org.
Support for this program is provided by the Foundation for Excellence in Louisiana Public Broadcasting.